I want to start with the hardest question of the day. Who is George?
Oh, yeah, start with the toughies, man. Let's see, I think first and foremost, man, I am a husband and I'm a father of two incredible young ladies. They are my guiding light, for sure. The reason I get up every day, no question. In between those hours, I consider myself a entrepreneur. I consider myself a food activist. I consider myself a developer. I'm very drawn to in realizing and recognizing that the food system and the food infrastructure in the United States has been something that has been crumbling slowly but surely over the last 40 years. And so about a decade ago, I made a very conscious decision to change my career. I was working in the staffing and recruiting industry, spent some time in Northern California and got exposed to agriculture on a massive scale. And I remember driving through one of the valleys in Lake County one day being surrounded by pear groves and walnut groves and orchards and vineyards. And just, I remember thinking to myself, like, ag is going to be how I make it. I don't know how that's going to manifest or what that's going to look like, but this is where I want to be. And, I'd spent some time, in that couple of years working on farms. And as a former athlete, it was the first time I had been engaged mentally, physically, emotionally. And one of the things that I love about agriculture the most and working on a farm is that if you don't do the work, then there's no one else. And so I remember just loving taking that ownership. And as my career kind of evolved, I'm very much a systems thinker. I was working for an indoor vertical farming and horticultural lighting company at one point in my career, and we just sold the vertical farming system. But we then, part of our service was essentially building the entire team that would execute the project. And I remember just loving that process of finding the controls folks, finding the HVAC folks, finding the nutrient management folks, and building that team to ultimately execute on a food-based project. And so I did that for about 3 years, and then about 4.5 years ago, broke off and started Skout Strategy. And really with the focus of building local and regional food infrastructure, and of course with controlled environment agriculture kind of at the forefront of that. Mm-hmm. But over the last couple of years, the way that has evolved has been moving from indoor vertical farming to large-scale greenhouse to designing and planning local and regional food aggregation sites, working with food co-ops to kind of look at the entire value chain within the food system. I think all of those things really kind of make me who I am and definitely shape how I show up on a daily basis.
Do you think the world needs more technology, or do you think the world needs more integration?
I think the world needs more integration of technology, mm-hmm. right? And I think we talk a lot about technology, but we don't necessarily talk enough about the application mm-hmm. of the technology. And so I think oftentimes the technology is applied in ways that may not necessarily be relevant or are the most effective way of applying said technology, mm-hmm. right? And so I think it really kind of depends on the situation mm-hmm. and looking at where technology can be the most beneficial and applying it to those places, opposed to just kind of using that as a blanket statement and trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Yeah, a lot of that. And I think some of the single point technologies fail that way because we're looking for that next incremental efficiency or solution to inefficiency.
Right.
And then that technology has to stand alone and have its own IP in order to get funded, in order to grow. But we missed a lot of times the opportunity to integrate because two different technologies 1 + 1 may equal 4. And I think we miss a lot of that. Why are we seemingly so short on developers? We got a lot of developers in the real estate industry, and they take big risks. They go find a piece of land or they knock down a building and they turn it into some other beneficial use. Why is that not the case in agriculture?
I don't really think people understand the inherent value of agriculture, right? And the value that it creates in terms of building infrastructure, creating resiliency within a community. But I also think, you have to look at agriculture as a whole, right? I mean, the United States has really hollowed out our agricultural industry the same way that we have manufacturing. We just don't talk about it in that sense. In 2022, the United States became a net importer of food.
That's incredible.
And it probably happened before that, but that really is when that turning point really happened. And so I don't think food policy is geared towards incentivizing development within the agricultural space. I don't think the capital stacks or the capital markets exist for that type of development, and understanding that VC and private equity may not necessarily be a great fit for something that needs to be amortized over 25 years
or more
return on investment. And so I think, again, feeding ourselves, which I think we have come to take for granted, being able to go to the grocery store and get whatever we want whenever we need to. And so I think that's a big piece of it. And I think lastly, I mean, agriculture is a very difficult industry to make a living in. And again, I think policy has shaped that in ways that we're not really familiar, right? I mean, I was reading a report USDA put out probably about a month ago, just about how much of our food production has shifted to primarily Mexico and also Canada, right? Peru as well. And I think, a lot of that has to do with free trade. I think a lot of that has to do with labor costs. And, conversely, you see the effect on the American farm industry as a whole. Tomato production in the United States in that time down 45%. Watermelon production down 50%. You're seeing big chunks of production that used to happen in the United States that are gone. And then conversely in Mexico, a lot of the sustenance small family farms that used to exist there are now gone, and they're being replaced by industrial scale farms. And so I think the hollowing out of agriculture on both sides has had that effect.
Yeah, I agree. I truly agree. It seems that when we talk labor, and then we'll jump to VC, because I really love to get your feedback on what you've experienced in VC and private equity, because I know you work on a multitude of deals. The excuse is always labor, in my humble opinion. And I use the word excuse specifically because we have a significant number of unemployed people.
Yeah.
And they also aren't just unemployed. They also don't have the education. So why not earn doing something? I hear a lot of CEA operators specifically. We were just with one recently, and I hear that, they had high school kids, they didn't last a week. We had 10 people in the last 6 months, average age 30, no college degree. Some of them barely made it out of high school, some tradespeople. Why is it that Americans don't seemingly want these jobs in agriculture?
Yeah, I think that's a very multifaceted question.
Yeah.
And I think, just kind of talking about the cost of labor, right? That USDA report pointed out $15 a day for a day labor in Mexico versus in the United States, you're paying someone $18 an hour, right? So I think there's that cost variation. And I think ultimately who you've seen benefit from that are large multinational corporations, right? Who have found it easier to invest in Mexico, Peru, places where the labor rates are lower. Yeah. The regulatory burden is also lower, which ultimately is going to equal cost. And then the reality is they could pay a cheaper price and purchase that produce and have a truck to wherever it needs to go, still at a lower cost than it would cost for them to grow it in the United States. I think as it relates to the labor force in the United States and agriculture, I think we've lost sight of the importance of the farm, right? I mean, that used to be something that we taught. Most high schools across the country had an FFA program that was attached to the high school. But I also think there's a lot of stigmas that have been created around agriculture. And I think you can go back as far as time, and really throughout history, the people who have grown our food historically have always been people of the peasant class. And so that really has never changed. And I think agriculture hinges on migratory labor. I think it hinges on people not being paid a fair living wage. And then I ultimately think, we talk about farm laborers and agricultural work as unskilled skill sets. And I think it couldn't be any farther from the truth.
Amen.
As it relates to the skill that it takes to essentially be able to nurture a plant from the time that it's planted in the ground to the time that it's harvested, whether that is pest pressure, whether that is nutrient deficiencies, whether that is harvesting it and ensuring it can get to where it needs to go. There is an immense amount of skill that we that goes into growing anything. And I think oftentimes we don't put enough respect on what it takes to actually get something grown and on your plate.
Yeah.
And, I think the old saying goes, right? Like, I need a farmer 3 times a day. I see my doctor every 6 months.
Sure.
But who's taking home the bag and who's not?
Sure.
And so I think all of those things still apply. And at some point, we're going to have to make a conscious effort to invest in agriculture in the U.S.
Before we go specifically to PE and VC, where does the money come from to make this transition? Because, you got big companies like here in Philadelphia, FMC and BASF and Dow and all these chemical companies. They can only do so much. You can only get so far away from your core business before you start outstripping the expertise and the structure of your labor base. You can do a lot of things through partnership, but public-private partnerships have existed. They don't seem to be getting us the results. So where's the money come from?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Charles. I think that's one that we're kind of all trying to understand, right? And I think this is not just as it's geared towards CEA, but I think there needs to be a larger agricultural reset across the United States, right? And I think controlled environment agriculture is one piece of that. But I think as an entire segment in an entire sector, it needs to be reorganized,
Sure.
right? And I think one of the byproducts, particularly of free trade and just kind of the consolidation that has happened within our food system, right? I talk a lot about antitrust in my work, or the lack of enforcement of antitrust, particularly you could see it all across our economy, but agriculture is one of the most consolidated industries that exists. And so I think at some point we are going to have to reorganize this industry, but I think we are going to have to, from a federal standpoint, from a state standpoint, from a municipal standpoint, make a conscious effort to make investments back into agriculture. And whether that is workforce development and training, whether that is having states and the federal government be key investors at private universities or public universities. I mean, that used to be the reason for land grant institutions, right? Was they were training grounds for the future of our agricultural industry. And today, the vast majority of land-based institutes are being carried by corporate interests.
Sure.
And so I think those are all things that are very intertwined. And I think, when we talk about where does the money come from, again, I do think it is going to have to come from significant policy shifts. But then from a consumer standpoint as well, I think we also have to change our perspective as it relates to food and it being the cheapest thing that we, go out and buy, right? 5-10% of our income. But the reality is, in other countries that are perceived to have better food quality, those families are spending 30% of their income, which you rewind the clock back 75 years in this country, and that really is what it was. Yeah. And so I think there's kind of a confluence of events that has to happen in order for us to reset our food system. But I think education is critical. I think government investment is going to be critical. But I do think also private actors need to realize that this is a slow-moving national crisis, right? I mean, we talk a lot about national security. Food is national security.
Absolutely.
But we are also going through the single largest energy transition of our species' lifetime. Sure. I just moved to the east and mid-Atlantic from the Southwest, where we have a water crisis that we continue to put off. The Colorado River over the next 25 years is going to be running at half of what it is today. And oh, by the way, 90% of the leafy greens we consume in this country from March until November are all grown in California, and 80% of that water is going to agricultural uses. The other 10% are being grown in Arizona, which are also relying on that same water. Yeah. And so at some point, we're going to have to recognize that we have to begin to shift where our food is produced and how it's produced, right? Knowing that we are also facing this challenge of a changing energy infrastructure. We have a lot of technologies that are coming online that are very energy and resource intensive. And so is agriculture in many ways, right? And so I think part of it, again, all of these things are interconnected, understanding how water plays into this, understanding how energy plays into this, understanding how labor plays into this. All of these things are interconnected. And so we have to be able to approach all of these different things, yes, in their own individual right, but understand the cascading effects of if we make a decision here and we pull this lever, what effect is it going to have over here?
Yeah, agreed.
Right. And so I think those are all really big questions that I do think oftentimes are really difficult to broach. And so it's easier to say, well, yeah, we need to develop data centers and let's put 500 billion towards data centers. And that's a whole new thing we can run to, opposed to saying, but look at this train wreck over here that we created. We're not going to touch that right now.
Yeah, the ostrich syndrome, head in the sand.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of strands in there, and I'm happy to hear you say we don't have all the answers, but we got to get going in that direction. Private equity. Let's talk private equity and VC and debt. Let's just all summarize it as capital markets, right? You are working on a multitude of deals, and why, or what is the most single facet of deal making in our collective space that stops private equity from coming into the market? And I say that from the perspective of we've put $8+ billion into CEA in the U.S. We've had App Harvest and all those things. And I know that the onset of a technology revolution generally has some failures. But again, what's stopping the capital markets from fully going in here?
I mean, again, I think you have to look at the industry dynamics, right? We often talk about technology and the reality of what's happening in the market in two very different contexts. Yeah. And I think oftentimes it's one thing to say that we're going to feed the world and our technology and our greenhouse is going to feed the world, but we don't realize the markets that we're going into, right? We don't realize that they can grow that same head of lettuce in a greenhouse in Mexico for half the cost, if not more, than what you can grow it for here in the United States, which is the reality. And so I think there's a misalignment in terms of the expectation of returns. Venture capital is looking at getting a return on their money within 3 to 5 years. Private equity is looking at getting a return on their money within 5 to 7, and that's just not necessarily how agriculture works.
At all.
It's a low margin business. This is not a technology business. This is the food industry, which historically has incredibly thin margins because of those other market dynamics. And so I think when you look at the way that our food system's going, you look at consolidation. Little Leaf right now is kind of the darling of the industry. You know, they've got a 30-acre site here in Pennsylvania. They just are breaking ground on another 40-acre site in Tennessee, which is great. But they're growing to meet the demand of the biggest retailers in the world. Which ultimately, at some point, there's going to be a breaking point, right? Because they're going to want you to continue to produce more, but those margins are going to continue to disappear and get thinner and thinner. And so I don't necessarily think that is a sustainable model. I would rather have 10 Little Leafs operating, versus one big dominant player in the market, personally. And so, yeah, man, I mean, I think there's just a mismatch in terms of the way that the funds are aligned in terms of some of the private capital markets and the expectation of a return. Now, I think over a 10, 15, 20-year time horizon, you're going to get a nice return that is going to be very consistent if catastrophe doesn't happen in your farm, which this is agriculture, and that can happen. And so I think there just needs to be better alignment in terms of what the expectation is out of the capital markets and the returns that they can get from a controlled environment, an investment in controlled environment ag, or just ag in general. But I think there's also, again, the old triple bottom line effect as well, right? Of the environmental piece, the energy intensity piece. All of those pieces to me are what actually create the value in terms of a CEA facility versus just what margin you're going to get at the end of it. And I think understanding those impacts, right, and being able to quantify those impacts is a really valuable thing. And understanding that a tomato that's grown in Lancaster and purchased in Philly is only going to have to travel maybe
60 miles.
And chances are that farmer is getting a fair share of what the cost of production is versus that same tomato that comes from Mexico, right? And so ultimately, those local dollars that are being spent back in the local community go further
Yes.
than, just getting a tax that you're paying at the grocery store. So I think it has to be a more comprehensive approach to understanding how does the investment in this actually equate to value in a community.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's a much deeper look into the value that these farms can create versus just what my margin's going to be at the end of this thing.
Yeah, that's fair. That's really fair. We were talking about your transition to the East Coast, to the Mid-Atlantic. At a high level, what brought you here?
Oh man,
That's a long haul.
it is a long haul.
We were on the call while you were driving.
We were that 26-foot U-Haul, and I got very familiar. Man, I think my family just needed a change of environment. I think we all kind of fell into some habits during the pandemic that, some of them were good, some of them weren't. And I think part of it was we just needed a new adventure. And I wanted to expose my girls to an area that just had a bit more cultural diversity and they could gain a different perspective. I think professionally, this has been where my business has primarily been, is on the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, down to the Southeast. And so for me, it just made more sense to be here where I could actually hop in the car and drive a few hours and be at a client site versus having to get on multiple flights and fly across the country. Those were all dynamics that I think, played into it. And then, as someone coming from Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is a place that is a beautiful city, incredible culture. I went to high school there. I played college football there. Got my degrees from there. It's an incredible place to be, but also very isolated, right?
Yes.
You can drive 4 hours in any direction and still be in the
desert.
middle of nowhere, New Mexico. And so I wanted to, and the thing I love about being on the East Coast and just the Mid-Atlantic is you can hop in the car in 2 hours and be in a completely different environment and be exposed to completely different things. And so part of it, all of those things I think were part of the decision to make a move and really uproot my family from all that we've all ever known. And I think for me, at the end of the day, man, it's going to be good for all of us to gain a new perspective. New Mexico's always going to be there. Our family's always going to be there. But ultimately, I think it came down to exposure to more opportunity for all of us.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. What do you think the region now, besides just the broader diversity and the broader experiences, when you think about workforce development, you got your kids in a county school system, a county neighboring Philadelphia County, so they're right there on the cusp of Philadelphia. What does this region offer in terms of workforce development and experience that Albuquerque, New Mexico doesn't?
Ooh, man, I think that's a great question. And, one of the big things for me that when I went back home after one of my trips here, I look at the state of New Mexico in totality, and we've got 5 higher education institutes. That's it. We've got University of New Mexico, we've got New Mexico State, we've got New Mexico Tech, which is primarily an engineering school, and we've got Eastern and Western New Mexico. That is it. Just within the greater Philadelphia area, you've got UPenn, you've got Drexel, you've got Temple, you've got Villanova, so just that, I think for me was pretty eye-opening just in terms of the educational opportunities.
Within 20 miles.
Within 20 miles.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not even canvassing the entire state. And you go across to New Jersey and it's just crazy.
Yeah.
And so I think that for me was really eye-opening. And I think becoming a parent, right, just changes your perspective on the world in terms of where you want your children to grow up and how you want them to grow up and what you want them to be exposed to. I lived for the vast majority of my life 10 minutes from the university campus, and I never walked on that campus. I never got exposure to that campus. Yeah. I didn't know how you even became an engineer. I didn't get exposed to any of those things. And so I want to put my daughters in a situation to where they can be exposed to so much more in terms of what the world has to offer and what you can become in this world. And just getting exposure to that, I think in itself is pretty inspiring because you can see reflections of yourself in other people, or you can glean other perspectives in ways that you may not necessarily be able to. And I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, right? So part of it is also how do we change the pattern?
Sure.
right? And how do we break some of the cycles that our family has historically been in? And I think part of that sometimes is making the difficult decision to say, I'm going to leave everything I know and I'm going to stretch myself in profound new ways to become something different.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that's fair. That's fair. You and I were talking earlier about your daily commute to get the girls to school and how you're shifting that. And Broad Street in and of itself, from top to bottom, being a Philly school kid, it took the subway to school. It's like 20 different neighborhoods within 2 miles on one straight street. And, speaking to the fact you see yourself in others, I think Philadelphia does an extraordinary job with that. There's some institutes and things like the Franklin Institute and museums that add to its culture that go just beyond the richness of being part of the origin story of the U.S., but there's just so many little corridors of culture. Philly's like a patchwork of different colors.
Yeah.
And you go from one neighborhood to another in 4 blocks, and it's like 2 different worlds.
100%.
It's I mean, I know that there's New York and Chicago and D.C. also have that, but maybe I'm just biased from Philly. But I think it's really strong in Philadelphia. So I'm looking forward to meeting the girls and helping them experience different things that impacted me as a kid. And transition there to MLK. You're doing some things at MLK. Our partner, dear colleague at Chase, Tyrone, he's alumni. What's going on in MLK?
MLK is a high school in Philadelphia that, again, I mean, this school, I want to say, is 90 plus years old. So it's massive, close to 2,500 students.
Definitely.
And right now, they're probably hovering around 500. And so part of the plan there is to develop kind of it's the best way to, just an indoor farm, right? That, essentially these kids can get exposure to. We're looking at creating kind of a 2-year apprenticeship program where they're in the program for 2 years. They're getting hands-on experience in an indoor farm, but it's also then about teaching them and putting together a curriculum that is really about looking at the food system in its entirety. It's really an agribusiness course. So yes, the farm is there, but it's also looking at all of the different buckets that make up a food system. It's food production, it's processing, it's co-packing, it is distribution, it's the cold chain, it is retail, and everything in between. And again, it's about exposure, right? And I think oftentimes folks don't get exposure to all of the different opportunities that exist. And I think the reality is, when you look at every segment of our food system, it has been consolidated in a significant way. And so I think part of building that back is exposing people to where the opportunities exist. And I think food production is just a really easy place to start because it's tangible and you can put your hands on it. And I do think the way that technology has been developed over the last 20 years, particularly on the indoor agriculture side, it allows us to use existing infrastructure to produce food in places where you historically would not think you could produce food in significant amounts of it. And so I think that in itself is part of the value proposition that we look to when we talk about indoor vertical farming, of being able to use existing infrastructure and leverage that infrastructure to create food production. And particularly in communities that are considered food deserts, food swamps, whatever you want to call it.
Isn't all of Philadelphia a food desert?
It is, the entire city.
Which is hard to believe.
Which is hard to believe. But again, these are dynamics that, to me, have been shaped by policy, right? The United States in general, over the last 20 years, has lost 30% of its grocery stores. That is absolutely insane. And I can only imagine what that looks like for farmland, what that looks like for family farms, all of those things, what that looks like for cannery, again, up and down the entire food system. I think the reality is we keep looking around all the major cities in the U.S. and we're like, damn, they're all food deserts. Like, this is a problem. And so I think Philadelphia is just a microcosm of the larger issues that are at play within our food system. And I think particularly around fresh produce. I was having a conversation with Bill earlier. I mean, he was talking about how a lot of his clients in Lancaster are moving to produce production again because a lot of that has gone away. But now those markets are opening up.
Sure.
And I think it's wild to me that in 2025, it's easier to go down to the corner store and get liquor or alcohol than it is organic produce.
Or candy.
Or processed foods. And I mean, you can even look at the numbers of produce has gone up over the last decade by 50%, but ultra-processed foods, the cost of ultra-processed foods continues to go down. And it's no surprise that we see diet-related diseases, heart disease, diabetes that are skyrocketing. And it's like everyone's wondering why this is happening. And the reality is it's because of the food that we have access to. And that is a central part of the issue that we just don't want to address. And that's just the reality of what our food system is becoming and the direction that it's going. And so this is an opportunity to, one, educate people on that, but then two, show them pathways that can be created in order for them to begin to change that scenario. And I love the narrative around urban farms. I think urban farms are an incredible way for communities to inspire people. I think they are incredible teaching grounds. I think they are incredible places to show people how to grow things so that when you walk through a community, everyone's got a garden bed outside of their flat, right? And they're growing some of their own produce, and it's changing the narrative. And so I think more of that is needed. And I think, again, the work at MLK, what is most powerful about that is a lot of that produce and a lot of that food is going to go directly into the cafeteria there. They've got a whole concept around a salad bar, and they've got a little farmers market that they're going to start having. There's a couple other farms that are involved. And so you're now creating access to fresh, locally grown food to a population of people who have historically not had access to that type of food.
Yeah, it's I swallow that whole, and I'll even offer a different layer on top of it. MLK was my neighborhood high school, and being from Mount Airy, it was a tough time in the 90s. I graduated high school in 96, and that was not necessarily considered a safe school to go to. It wasn't. This was pre-STEM, way before all that. So it was a tough school. Having spent a lot of time in science as a kid, and coming from a military and federal family, I ended up in a place where I tested and went to a different school. And Walter Biddle Saul, the School for Agricultural Sciences, was a progenitor for urban agriculture in the country. And it's in Philadelphia. I tell people that, and they look at me and they go, wait a minute. What? Wait a minute. That can't be true. But it is.
Yeah.
And here you are going to what is a classic representation of a neighborhood high school in a decent area, the greater Mount Airy, Germantown, West Oak Lane. Germantown High School is closed, so we've had some consolidation, but still yet, the school's only at 25% occupancy.
Yeah.
So something's going on that's a more systemic issue. And then you go 8 miles away to Saul, and you're now in a place where those kids are fully focused on agriculture, and they're part of this Philadelphia school system's career technical education cluster, but they're not performing well either. And the infrastructure is underutilized. It's not maintained to where we would like to see it as alumni, but they're doing indoor and outdoor agriculture. There are still live animals there, livestock of multiple types. I share all that because you and I, at the same time, and earlier we were talking about getting you over to Saul, we're solving the systemic issue from two ends. You have the darling of agriculture high school and CTE and STEM education 8 miles from a basic neighborhood high school, and we're doing the same things. So it's a systemic issue that is extremely difficult to hurdle, and I want you to see. I'm very much looking forward to you to see what's actually going on over there, so you could look at it through your eyes from a visitor and a new resident, and hopefully we catch the girls in time and get the infrastructure right, and they can become alumni too.
Yeah, man.
So it's a pleasure to walk arm in arm with you to get through it.
No doubt.
What is Skout Strategy?
So Skout Strategy is an advisory firm that is really focused on helping our clients navigate the process of designing, building, and implementing local and regional food infrastructure. And again, knowing that we have a really strong core in controlled environment ag projects, but beginning to move into different areas of the food system and the food supply chain. So one of the most recent projects that I finished up with my team earlier this year was a 25,000 square foot aggregation site in New Mexico for a group called La Cosecha, who works with 75 local farmers across the state of New Mexico. They aggregate all of their produce and then they distribute it into the market. They go as far as coordinating what is grown, what crops are being grown. They all work with each other because much of their market is the local institutional buyers of food, the school system, hospital systems. And oftentimes you can't get into those markets if you don't have a certain amount of volume. And so they are creating a new market for local and regional farmers, state of New Mexico. And we've got another project like that down in Brunswick, Georgia, that we're working on with a group, Ebony Tree, that I've been working with for the last 4 years, really good friends of mine. So very similar approach there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Charles, we are focused on enabling the growth of local and regional food systems, whatever that may look like. And so we consider ourselves, yes, to be experts within the realm of controlled environment ag, but understanding that controlled environment agriculture connects into a much larger conversation around the food system. And so I am one who is very drawn to policy. I'm very drawn to the way that markets are being built and they're designed and understanding how we fit into those markets. And so I generally help a lot of my clients also understand those dynamics in terms of what they're getting themselves into and how you chart a path in these industries where the odds may not necessarily be in your favor.
Sure.
And how do you open up those new markets per se?
I'm glad to hear you say that. There's a certain level of being technology agnostic.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of arguments around CEA. Is it the next generation? Is the traditional Venlo style greenhouse? Is it just the next generation of a hoop house? Or isn't confined animal feeding operations or concentrated animal operations, aren't they controlled agriculture?
Yep, they are.
Too. So I think there's a big disconnect in terms of what CEA represents today.
Yep.
And I think we need to work together to make sure everyone's welcome and feels welcome. There are Amish growers that grow tobacco in tunnels.
Yeah.
So there's a range of technology scale in terms of
100%.
sophistication.
Yeah.
And I think we need to all do a better job. Producers feel welcome, because I've had to shut down a fair number of conversations that were threat-based. Well, if we to grow corn, well, we're growing corn to feed animals, and that's a cycle. But we also need fresh food.
Yep.
And we here on the Mid-Atlantic only really have one growing season plus a cover crop. So if we're trying to extend the 24/7, 365 basis of agriculture here in the Mid-Atlantic, we need to take some of this stuff indoors, let alone the resiliency, let alone the food security, let alone all those other features in addition. But here locally, regionally, there's a disconnect.
Yeah.
It seems like CEA, the traditional Dutch style, what Little Leaf represents, is a threat. And I'll cap that off by saying, I'm pretty sure Little Leaf is still just making lettuce.
That's it, man.
So
That's it.
what threat?
Yeah.
Amish farmers aren't making lettuce for salads.
That's right.
Not right now.
That's right.
And if they are, it's a minority of the plain set.
Yeah.
There's a lot of arguments and I think hurdling of the territorial mindset. Well, this is what we do. I think we need to get over some of that stuff, and I think there's more education to be done in a very big way. And I think we need to get out there and publicly speak through platforms like this, that is right at the beginning, and make sure we level set and clarify everybody's welcome. There's no silver bullet, not technology, not single produce, none of that. We are all in the same position.
Well, I think there's been a lot of us versus them, right, in this industry of this is CEA and this is everyone else, and this is how people used to farm, and this is how farms of the future are going to look. And I think that type of rhetoric it doesn't belong. The reality is, like, we need food, and it doesn't matter who grows it.
Yeah.
That is the reality. And to your point around what CEA actually is, that we need to broaden that definition, because there are a lot of different ways. Yeah, just building a low-tech high tunnel to extend your season is technically CEA. And building a fully automated greenhouse,
with robots
and conveyor belts and all these other things is also CEA. And so I think we have to understand, again, it goes back to application.
Yes.
What markets are you trying to serve?
Yeah.
And to me, that has a lot to do with the whole conversation around it. I was in the Netherlands in June of this year, and I saw canopy covers to cover orchards and fruit trees to protect from frost damage and hail damage, and all of these things were automated. And it sounds crazy to think that you'd have 10 acres that all have a canopy under them, and by the push of a button, you've got something that will protect your crops. But that's the reality, and that, in a sense, is a controlled environment.
Yes.
And so I think that is just the reality of what CEA is, and I think it's different to everyone. And to your point, we have to be okay with that, and it's not any one thing. I do think being technology agnostic, I mean, that's something that my company has always kind of hung our hat on, is every situation calls for a different solution.
Yep.
And that's the reality of agriculture. We all want to talk about it as if it's this nice little square thing that we can put into every scenario, and that's just not how it works.
No.
Buildings are different, crops are different, all of these things are different, and you have to be able to take all of that into account. And again, that's the difficult part.
Yep. Yep.
And I think that's where we've gotten ourselves into trouble, is people, one size fits all. And the greenhouse I'm building in Florida is the same greenhouse I'm going to build in Pennsylvania. And they don't take any of those factors into account. And so I think that's where the developers have to exist. We have to understand those dynamics, and we have to almost act as a safeguard between who our clients are and who the technology companies are, to make sure that we're able to bridge that gap and be able to create plans that actually make sense for the people we're developing projects for.
I agree wholeheartedly. It's a pleasure to hear you speak on it. Last question. What ignites the whole powder keg?
Oh, man.
Is it famine? Is it, I gave the keynote speech at Saul's graduation this year, and I said, folks, we might run out of food.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all those things, right? I think for me, it is, again, going back to having two daughters and knowing that if we continue going at the rate that we are, like, the future is not going to be pretty for them. And so, again, I think about, we are in a time of intense technological revolutions. We have a very varying geopolitical scenario. The two biggest resources that we require in food production, energy and water, are not finite resources. And so, meanwhile, the rest of the world is going through a significant energy transition. And so I think we have to rethink the way that systems have been built and what they will look like in the future. And the work that we're talking about doing, Charles, we're not going to solve these problems tomorrow, but we can spend the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years building a hell of a foundation that sets forth a new path, right? And shows us that, there is another way. There is another path. And I think humans have done that time and time again.
Oh, yeah.
And not saying we need to reinvent the wheel, but we definitely need to rethink the way that the wheel has been built. And so it's going to take a lot of different stakeholders. It's going to take a lot of energy and effort. But I think at the end of the day, man, like, you've got to fight for something. And I think we're in a time right now where it's like we need to fight for some things. And as it relates to food, that's a pretty big one.
It's a big one.
That's a big one.
It's a big one. George, I love you, brother.
Love you too, man.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and
Yes,
thank you
indeed.
for being here today. This was fantastic.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Fantastic.